Hello everybody, what's going on? This is Andrew, and today I want to try something a little different. So, for those of you who have been paying attention to Magic and release schedules, you will know that the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, the D&D based set, comes out very soon. I'm actually recording this video on Wednesday, so the set comes out on Magic Arena tomorrow. But that means I can't play with any of these new cards yet, which kind of sucks. I usually like to have like certain videos queued up, and I won't be able to play with the cards in time to get a video out for today, obviously. So I was sitting around brainstorming what I could do for a video instead. And I was looking through the new cards and the new spoilers, and there were a couple cards that caught my attention. These two that I just had on screen in particular, this Hall of Storm Giants and Demolitch. And I'll talk more about these cards in a second, but it made me start thinking about deck building. On stream, I don't stream. In some of my previous videos, I've done a little bit of deck building and deck tuning in the Arena client, but since these cards aren't on Arena yet, I wanted to kind of take a look at these two cards and see if I could build a deck that figures out where they belong. Now, obviously, Demolitch is going to be very, very powerful in older formats. Demolitch is a 4-blue creature, a 4/3, that says the spell costs a blue less for each instant and sorcery you've cast this turn. And then you can just stop there, right? In older formats, you'll be able to either cast a bunch of 1-mana spells and play this for free on turn 4, or you'll be able to play cards like Manamorphose, cards that are mana neutral, or like Lava Spike in Modern, and Demolitch basically turns into the 5th through 8 copies of Arclight Phoenix, which is really powerful. In Standard, it's going to be less like obviously busted, but Demolitch actually has more text on it. Whenever it attacks, you can exile up to 1 instant or sorcery from your graveyard, copy it, and you may cast the copy. And you may cast Demolitch from your graveyard by exiling 4 instant and or sorcery cards from your graveyard in addition to paying its other costs, which is a lot. This is a recursive 4/3 body that, in Standard at least, blue decks will be really, really interested in. So, seeing this card got me thinking. And then knowing that Hall of Storm Giants exists got me thinking as well. There's a cycle of lands in this set that all enter the battlefield untapped on the first or second turns of the game, and then turn into creatures later on. And Hall of Storm Giants turns into a 7/7 blue giant creature with Ward 3. Hall of the Storm Giants is one of the biggest creature lands we've ever had. And that has the potential to give some sort of blue deck some really nice late game, especially if they flood out. Now, you probably can't get away with playing 4 copies of this card. I think 2 is where you'd want to start. But this got me thinking, is there a way that we can remake the mono blue deck like from Standard's past? Now, what kind of mono blue deck am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about something like this. I played this list at a Grand Prix in Denver a couple of years ago. I did pretty well with it. I ended up in 20th place. Now, you can ignore the black cards. Those don't really matter. You can replace those with islands and just random blue cards in the sideboard. But the gist of this deck is that it plays a bunch of 1-mana flyers. It has some disruption, and then it plays Curious Obsession, which is a card that gives you value over the course of the game. As long as a creature keeps attacking, you keep drawing cards, which lets you keep casting your counter spells, and so on and so forth. I really love the playstyle that this deck makes. I find it really fun to play, and so my first thought when seeing these two cards previewed was, okay, can we remake this deck? Now, a couple months ago, I built this, or I didn't build it. This deck was built and I played it. It's a slightly bigger mono blue deck, but it leans into Ascendant Spirit, which is a creature from Kaldheim that is in the same vein as Figure of Destiny from Lorwyn all those years ago, where it grows bigger and bigger the more mana you can put into it, and it plays really nicely with counter spells because you can hold up mana and counter a spell, and if they don't have anything to do, you can just pump your Ascendant Spirit instead. Now, obviously, this deck and this deck are nothing alike, but they have some similarities and some crossover. So this is kind of where I started looking at how we could build a brand new deck for a new standard. I think that when building decks, it's important to look at what decks did well previously, and what decks were successful and what the metagame was like at the time. Now, the metagame where this deck was successful doesn't exist anymore, obviously, but you can find similarities with what's going on right now. So all that being said, I took what I know from playing mono blue in the past, I combined it with some of the recent powerful cards seen here, and I came up with something like this. This is what I'm calling the mono blue Demolitch deck. It plays some 1-drops, some ops, Brazen Borrower, obviously, and then this version leans into Sea Dasher Octopus as your card draw engine, and then you play Demolitch on top, like I was talking about before. Now, I don't know if this deck is any good. I will be completely honest. Haven't played a game with this deck, but if I look at what it's doing, it's got an engine. It's got a couple different engines, actually, right? Demolitch is kind of an engine in itself. It can fuel itself once it gets going, and it has recursion. It's got Ascendant Spirit and Stonecoil Serpent, which are both good targets for Sea Dasher Octopus to jump onto and start drawing you cards. It's got some counter spells, and there's this new card. You see a Guard Approach, which kind of does everything. It's not quite unsummon. Tapping a creature isn't quite unsummon, and Hide is just a little bit worse than Dive Down was, but the flexibility that this card has is actually pretty good, and I think this will be very important in any mono blue deck that shows up. So we're playing 3 copies of You See a Guard Approach, some random counter spells. I don't know if the counter spell splits here are right or not. I'm gonna guess that they're not quite right. It's hard to know what counter spells to put into your deck before you know what other decks exist. But something like this seems good to me. And then we obviously need to play a bunch of snow-covered islands because we want to play Ascendant Spirit. And down here we've got the Hall of the Storm Giants. The sideboard you can kind of ignore. It's just a bunch of cards that I like. And cards that have been good over the last little bit. It doesn't really matter as much. But this is the first build of the deck. And I started looking at it, and as I was going through other cards, trying to figure out what I could fill this deck out with, something about this deck just didn't sit right with me. And I came across Yonti Malison, which is a 2-mana 2/1 that can't be blocked as long as it attacks alone, and whenever it hits your opponent, you venture into the dungeon. Now, again, these are the dungeons that exist. These are cards that are not really cards. They kind of exist where everybody has access to any of them at any given time. And this is a way that the mono blue deck could get some minor advantages. So I looked over the dungeons, and I think the one that we would probably want to go through most often in a mono blue deck is this one on the left, the Lost Mine of the Pandelver. You scry one, and then you either make a 1/1 or make a treasure token, and then you pump up a creature, drain your opponent, or give something -4/-0, and then you draw a card. I think that's the one we would probably want to go for. There's a chance that just making a 4/4 and the Tomb of Annihilation could be good. And this one does a lot of things, but it kind of takes a long time to get to the end. So all that being said, I think that the Lost Mine is the one that I think that we would want to venture into most often. But I mean, look, you scry one, you make a 1/1, you turn it into a 2/2, you draw a card. That's okay on a 2/1 that's just getting in damage all the time anyways. So I think this card, not great, but solid. Fly is a card that also ventures into the dungeon. It's kind of sort of comparable to Curious Obsession, in that it's an enchantment that makes a creature better than it used to be and gives you some sort of card advantage as the game goes on. Obviously, venturing into the dungeon is not quite as good as drawing a card, and flying and +1/+1. Sometimes you'd rather have flying, sometimes you'd rather have +1/+1. But I think this card has the potential to be good, I will say. So I've got this card, and I'm looking at this deck list, and I'm like, something just doesn't seem right. I'm not in love with the Stonecoil Serpents. They seem kind of mopey. I just don't know. And I don't even know if this is a good Demolitch deck. Like, all of our instants and sorceries are reactive, other than the Opt. So what are we doing with Demolitch? We're not really taking advantage of casting spells proactively to return it to the battlefield. As much as I want this to be a good card for our deck, I just don't know if it is. So that's when I came across Grazolax, Illithid Scholar. This is a 3-drop that says whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you may return it to its owner's hand. And whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. I think this is the card we've been waiting for. Drawing cards in combat is so important for decks like this. And being able to save your creatures from blocks is also quite important. And since most of the creatures that we've been looking at are really cheap, returning it to your hand to replay later is pretty good. The last pieces of the puzzle was Silver Raven, this 1-mana 1/1 flyer that just what says when it enters the battlefield, you scry one. Sometimes scrying one can be just as good as drawing a card, especially when you're bottoming a land you don't need. So having a couple copies of this around seems okay. It's also a good target for Sea Dasher Octopus, and a good target, or another creature that can get in hits and draw cards once Grazolax hits the battlefield. So put all of that together, and this is what I came up with. Still have the Ascendant Spirits, but the rest of the deck's changed quite a bit. So we've got Ascendant Spirit, Merfolk Windrobber, and Silver Raven on one. Again, Merfolk Windrobber is a 1-mana 1/1 flyer. Whenever it hits them, you mill their top card, and if they have 8 or more cards in their graveyard, you can sacrifice the Windrobber to draw a card. Really, it's a 1-mana 1/1 flyer with slight upside later on in the game. So you've got 10 1-drops, and then you've got Yuan-Ti Malison and Sea Dasher Octopus and Petty Theft on 2. And then on 3, you've got Grazolax Illithid Scholar. Now that we're playing a lot more flyers, right? We're playing 6 flyers on 1. Ascendant Spirit gets flying eventually. Brazen Borrower has flying. I think Lofty Denial becomes the counterspell of choice, the same way that like Wizard's Retort and nope, not that one, this one, and Lookout's Dispersal were the counterspells of choice back in this deck. You can probably just play 4 Lofty Denial and be relatively happy with that. Mystical Dispute you still want for sure. Having a Disdainful Stroke seems pretty good based on the other decks in Standard right now. That could change based on what else is going on. And then we've got 2 copies of Fly. Going Ascendant Spirit on 1, attach Fly, hold up, you see a Guard Approach on 2, hit, and venture into the dungeon. Seems like a perfectly fine play pattern. We've still got 20 islands and 2 Hall of the Storm Giants. This card is going to be really nice for closing out the game. We chip in some damage early on with our flyers, and maybe our opponent stabilizes a little bit. maybe we get to a spot where we're drawing a lot of lands, but as long as we have one counterspell for the one card that they have that matters, we can potentially turn the corner and just win the game with Hall of Storm Giants. Again, the sideboard's kind of just whatever. The only card I want to talk about here is Ray of Frost. This card's pretty good against red decks, so having a couple copies of that is probably fine. But yeah, I'm kind of liking where this deck ended up. Again, I don't know if it's good enough, but now we've got Grazolax and Sea Dasher Octopus as ways to draw extra cards. Of course, Brazen Borrower is powerful, Ascendant Spirit's very powerful, and we've got some nice things to do to back those up. So yeah, this is kind of where I ended on the cheaper mono blue deck that is supposed to look kind of like this deck. I don't think it's quite as good, but I'm definitely going to try it out as soon as these cards go live and standard settles down a little bit, so watch for that video in a couple weeks. I hope you've enjoyed this deck tech and kind of me walking through my deck building process. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the things I really like to do is go back and look at old decks and see if there's a way you can kind of rebuild them with similar cards in current formats. And that's what I did here. I really wanted to rebuild this deck, and I think we got kind of close with this. It's not quite the same, obviously, but I think it's pretty close. And yeah, I hope that me talking through my thought process in building the deck made sense, and I hope that you enjoyed it. So I'm gonna call this video here. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know how this went, and if you have any tips for how I could do something like this different or better next time. Thank you all. Have a good one, and I will see you next time. Bye.